The cold spray of the English Channel slapped against the steel hull of the landing craft as Private James Miller clutched his rifle with white knuckles. Around him, 30 other men, some praying, some vomiting, most silent, swayed with the violent pitching of the vessel. It was 4:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, and they were minutes away from attempting what many military strategists had deemed impossible: the invasion of Nazi-occupied France across the heavily fortified beaches of Normandy. This was Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious military assault in human history. In the pre-dawn darkness, over 6,000 ships carried more than 150,000 Allied troops toward 5 codenamed beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the French coastline. Above them, the sky filled with the drone of over 11,000 aircraft, while more than 20,000 paratroopers had already descended into the darkness behind enemy lines. The fate of Europe, and perhaps the entire war, hinged on what would happen in the next 24 hours. "The eyes of the world are upon you," General Dwight D. Eisenhower had told them in his final address. "The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you." This account draws from the personal testimonies compiled by the United States Army's Center of Military History and the National D-Day Memorial Foundation's Oral History Archives. Planning for D-Day had begun more than 2 years earlier. The Allied commanders, American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, and others, faced a monumental task. They needed to land enough men and equipment on hostile shores to establish a beachhead from which they could push inland and eventually liberate Western Europe from Nazi control. The Germans, led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had transformed the coastline into what they called the Atlantic Wall, an intricate system of bunkers, artillery positions, machine gun nests, minefields, and beach obstacles designed to repel any invasion force. Rommel had famously declared, "The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. For the Allies, as well as for Germany, it will be the longest day." Operation Overlord required unprecedented deception. The Allies created an elaborate ruse called Operation Fortitude, establishing a phantom army commanded by General George Patton that appeared poised to strike at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between England and France. Radio transmissions, dummy equipment, and false intelligence convinced Hitler that Normandy would merely be a diversion. Weather became another critical factor. The invasion required specific conditions: a full moon for illumination, low tide to expose beach obstacles, and calm seas for landing craft. The narrow window of opportunity came in early June. When storms threatened to derail the operation on June 5th, Eisenhower made the fateful decision to delay by 24 hours, gambling that conditions would improve enough by the following morning. As dawn approached on June 6th, the massive armada moved into position. The invasion force was divided among 5 beaches. Utah and Omaha would be taken by American forces, Gold and Sword by the British, and Juneau by the Canadians. The first wave would land at 0 hour, H hour, scheduled for 6:30 in the morning. The night before, Allied paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, along with British airborne forces, had jumped into the darkness behind enemy lines. Their objective: secure key bridges, road junctions, and exit routes from the beaches, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the coast. Despite being scattered widely across the Norman countryside, these paratroopers would create enough confusion and disruption to help the main assault force establish its beachhead. Now, as Private Miller and thousands like him approached the shores of Normandy, the greatest gamble of the war was about to unfold. The men in the landing craft could hear the naval bombardment and airstrikes pounding the German positions. What they couldn't know was whether this immense firepower had neutralized the deadly defenses that awaited them on the beaches. The landing ramps would soon drop, and the fate of the free world would rest on the shoulders of young men like Miller, many of whom had never before seen combat. The longest day had begun. The landing craft ramp dropped with a metallic clang, and immediately the morning erupted into chaos. German MG-42 machine guns opened fire, their distinctive high-pitched rattle, what American soldiers called Hitler's buzzsaw, cutting through the air at 1,200 rounds per minute. Men fell before they could exit the landing craft, their blood mixing with the salt water washing over the ramp. Many of us were hit before we could get 10 feet, recalled Sergeant Tom Valance of the 1st Infantry Division at Omaha Beach. Those who survived the initial fusillade found ourselves wading through water sometimes neck deep, carrying 70 pounds of equipment, watching men around us get torn apart by bullets or drown under the weight of their packs. This account incorporates details from the comprehensive study, Overlord D-Day and the Battle for Normandy, by military historian Max Hastings, and eyewitness accounts published in the Congressional Archives. The American forces at Omaha Beach faced the most difficult situation. The pre-invasion bombardment had largely missed its targets, leaving German defenses intact. High bluffs offered perfect positions for German gunners, who poured devastating fire onto the exposed Americans. Within minutes, the carefully planned assault deteriorated into a desperate struggle for survival. Colonel George Taylor of the 1st Infantry Division, seeing his men pinned down and taking heavy casualties, famously told them, "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." His words galvanized the surviving troops who began to inch forward under withering fire. Engineers worked frantically to clear paths through beach obstacles while under constant fire. Medics dragged wounded men behind whatever cover they could find: wrecked landing craft, natural depressions in the sand, the bodies of the fallen. Naval destroyers, seeing the disaster unfolding, moved dangerously close to shore, risking running aground to provide direct fire support against German positions. At Utah Beach, the American forces faced lighter resistance but landed a mile south of their intended position. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of the former president and at 56 the oldest man in the invasion force, personally reconnoitered the beach under fire. Realizing the error, he famously declared, "We'll start the war from here," and reorganized his forces to move inland. The British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches also met fierce resistance, but made better progress. By mid-morning, they had secured beachheads and begun moving inland toward their objectives. The Canadian troops at Juno Beach pushed farther inland than any other Allied force on D-Day, despite facing the second heaviest resistance. Behind the beaches, the scattered American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions fought to secure their objectives despite being widely dispersed. Lieutenant Richard Winters led a small group of men from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment in a successful attack on a German artillery position at Brecourt Manor, destroying 4 105mm howitzers that had been firing on Utah Beach. By noon, the situation at Omaha Beach remained critical. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American forces from the USS Augusta offshore, considered evacuating the beach, but small groups of determined soldiers, led by junior officers and non-commissioned officers, had begun scaling the bluffs between the German positions. These improvised assault teams gradually silenced the German strongpoints one by one. "We just kept moving," recalled Private Vincent Corsini. "If you stopped, you died. If you thought too much, you died. So we just kept moving forward, yard by yard." The German command structure, meanwhile, struggled to respond effectively. Field Marshal Rommel was away in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday. Hitler, convinced the Normandy landings were a feint, refused to release armored reserves that could have pushed the Allies back into the sea. General Erwin von Rundstedt, the German commander in the West, was hamstrung by Hitler's insistence that all major decisions required his personal approval. By evening, against all odds, all 5 beachheads had been established. The Allies had landed 156,000 men on French soil, at terrible cost. More than 4,000 Allied soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. They had achieved what Rommel had thought impossible. They had breached the Atlantic Wall. As night fell on that historic day, exhausted soldiers dug in on the edge of Hitler's fortress Europe. The beachheads were shallow and vulnerable, in some places extending less than a mile inland, but they had been won. The next challenge would be to hold them against the inevitable German counterattack. As dawn broke on June 7, 1944, the true scale of the Allied achievement and the challenges ahead became clear. The beachheads remained tenuous, separated from each other and vulnerable to counterattack. The German 15th Army remained intact to the east, and the elite panzer divisions were beginning to move toward Normandy. The crucial task now was consolidation, linking the 5 separate beachheads into a continuous front and pushing inland to expand the Allied foothold. "We expected to be thrown back into the sea by midday," recalled Captain James Hollingsworth of the 4th Infantry Division. "Instead, we found ourselves moving inland against scattered resistance. It was almost more unnerving than the landing itself. Where were the massive counterattacks we'd been warned about?" This narrative draws on documentation from the Eisenhower Presidential Library archives and the official history of the Canadian Army in the Second World War. The answer lay in the continuing success of Allied deception operations. Hitler remained convinced that the Normandy landings were a diversion and that the main attack would come at Pas de Calais. He personally refused to release the strategic armored reserves that might have pushed the Allies back into the Channel. This fatal hesitation gave the Allied forces precious time to strengthen their position. Meanwhile, the battle evolved differently across the invasion area. The American forces from Utah Beach linked up with paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division and began pushing toward the vital port of Cherbourg. At Omaha, after the bloodbath of the first day, American troops expanded their beachhead and moved toward their junction points with the British at Gold Beach. The British and Canadian forces made steady progress from their beaches, with the Canadians capturing the Carpiquet airfield near Caen by late afternoon on June 7th. The British tank crews, many of whom were operating specialized vehicles called Hobart's Funnies, modified tanks designed to clear obstacles, bridge ditches, and flatten minefields, proved crucial in overcoming German defensive positions. In the skies above Normandy, the Allied air forces maintained almost complete dominance. Fighter bombers swooped down to attack German reinforcements trying to reach the front, while transport aircraft dropped supplies to the advancing Allied troops. The German Luftwaffe, decimated by years of strategic bombing and air battles, could muster only occasional raids against the invasion fleet. At sea, the massive Allied armada continued to pour men and materials onto the beaches. Engineers constructed 2 artificial harbors, codenamed Mulberries, to facilitate the unloading of vehicles, equipment, and supplies. One would later be destroyed by a fierce storm, but the other remained operational throughout the campaign, landing over 2 million tons of supplies and 500,000 vehicles. The German response was hampered by confusion and poor communication. Field Marshal Rommel, having rushed back from Germany, found himself unable to coordinate an effective counterattack. Allied bombing had devastated the French railway network, making it difficult to move reinforcements to the front. German units that did reach the battlefield found themselves under constant air attack whenever they tried to maneuver. By June 9th, the 5 beachheads had been linked into a continuous front. Allied troops had pushed inland between 5 and 10 miles along most of the front, but the hardest fighting lay ahead. The bocage country of Normandy, a landscape of small fields surrounded by high, thick hedgerows planted on earthen banks, presented perfect defensive terrain. Each field became a potential fortress, and the hedgerows provided cover for German anti-tank guns and machine gun positions. "The hedgerows were like living fortifications," wrote Lieutenant Sidney Salomon of the 29th Infantry Division. "You could clear one field at the cost of a dozen men, only to find another 100 yards of identical terrain ahead, with the Germans waiting behind the next hedgerow." Field Marshal Montgomery, commanding the Allied ground forces, had planned to capture the city of Caen on the first day. But the city's defenders, including elements of the elite 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, composed largely of fanatical Hitler Youth members, led by battle-hardened officers, fought with exceptional determination. The British and Canadian forces found themselves in a grinding battle of attrition around the city. To the west, American forces began the difficult task of cutting off and capturing the Cotentin Peninsula, with its vital port of Cherbourg. The rugged terrain and determined German resistance slowed their advance, but by mid-June, they had succeeded in isolating the peninsula from the rest of Normandy. By June 12th, despite fierce resistance, the Allies had landed over 326,000 troops, 56,000 vehicles, and 104,000 tons of supplies. The foothold in Fortress Europe had been established, But the battle for Normandy was far from over. The question now was whether the Allies could break out of the beachhead before the Germans could contain them in a war of attrition. The Norman countryside, with its ancient hedgerows and narrow lanes, became a killing ground through the remainder of June and into July 1944. What Allied planners had hoped would be a swift breakout from the beaches instead devolved into a brutal slugging match, with gains measured in yards rather than miles. The hedgerows, earthen berms topped with tangled vegetation that had stood, for centuries, created natural defensive positions that negated many of the Allies' advantages in firepower and mobility. Each hedgerow was a fortress, each field a battlefield, wrote war correspondent Ernie Pyle. I saw a unit spend an entire day, losing 17 men, to advance less than 300 yards through this impossible terrain. This segment incorporates research from the United States Army's official history cross-channel attack and the extensive journalism of Ernie Pyle from the front lines. American soldiers dubbed this fighting the Battle of the Hedgerows, or more, officially the Battle of Normandy. The Germans called it the Hedgehog Defense, a strategy of turning each field into a miniature fortress. A German squad with a machine gun and perhaps a mortar could hold up an entire American company. Allied tanks, unable to see over the hedgerows and vulnerable when attempting to climb over them, frequently exposed their thinly armored undersides to German anti-tank weapons. In response, American ingenuity produced the Rhino tank, a standard Sherman tank fitted with steel tusks welded to the front that could punch through the hedgerows. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 2nd Armored Division designed the first such device using scrap metal salvaged from German beach obstacles. Within weeks, hundreds of Sherman tanks had been retrofitted with these Rhino devices, giving the Americans a crucial advantage in the hedgerow country. In the eastern sector, the British and Canadians faced the bulk of the German armored strength, around the city of Caen. Field Marshal Montgomery's forces launched a series of operations, Perch, Epsom, Windsor, and Charnwood, each gaining ground at heavy cost. The strategic bombing of Caen on July 7th left the historic city in ruins, but failed to dislodge the German defenders completely. The bombing created a moonscape of rubble that was, if anything, easier for the Germans to defend, noted British Lieutenant Maurice Hewitt. Every pile of debris became a machine gun nest, every crater an anti-tank position. Montgomery's tactics became controversial both during and after the war. His critics argued that he was too cautious and methodical, failing to seize opportunities for bold advances. His defenders counter that he deliberately fought an attritional battle to draw the bulk of German armor onto the British and Canadian sectors, allowing the Americans to eventually break out in the West. Precisely what later happened. The fighting exacted a terrible toll on all sides. Allied casualties mounted steadily, with some divisions suffering 30% losses within their first few weeks in combat. The Germans, unable to replace their losses as easily, found their units gradually whittled down. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's elite armored formations, lost nearly half its combat strength by early July. For the soldiers on both sides, the hedgerow fighting was a nightmarish experience of close-quarter combat, constant tension, and sudden violence. Snipers targeted anyone careless enough to stand up. Artillery continuously pounded suspected enemy positions. At night, patrols probed enemy lines, leading to terrifying hand-to-hand encounters in the darkness. You never knew if the next field was empty or held 50 Germans with machine guns, recalled Private Robert Sherwood of the 29th Infantry Division. The only way to find out was to go in, and sometimes that was the last thing you ever did. By mid-July, the Allies had pushed approximately 20 miles inland in some sectors, but the breakout from Normandy remained elusive. The city of St. Lo, a key road junction, became the focus of American efforts. After a week of house-to-house fighting, the Americans captured the shattered city on July 18th. General Omar Bradley described St. Lo as a pile of rubble 2 miles square, the most bombed, most shelled city in all Normandy. With St. Lo secured, the stage was set for Operation Cobra, the American plan to finally break out of the Normandy beachhead. On July 25th, after weather delays, over 1,500 heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force unleashed their payloads on German positions south of St. Lo, pulverizing an area 4 miles long and 1.5 miles deep. The SAO. Earth shook like an earthquake, recalled Lieutenant Howard Randall. When we moved forward, the landscape was unrecognizable, cratered, smoking, with human and mechanical remains scattered everywhere. The aerial bombardment, while devastating, was not without tragedy. Bombing accuracy issues and short drops resulted in several hundred American casualties from friendly fire. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, one of the highest-ranking American officers to be killed in combat during the war. Despite these setbacks, Operation Cobra achieved its objective. The German defenses south of St. Lo collapsed, and American armored columns began to push into the gap. After weeks of agonizingly slow advances, the front was finally breaking open. The war of attrition in the hedgerows was about to give way to a war of movement across the fields of France. By late July 1944, the immense pressure applied by the Allies across the Normandy front finally cracked the German defensive line. Operation Cobra had shattered the German positions south of St. Lo, creating the opportunity that General Omar Bradley and General George Patton had been waiting for. Now, American armor could finally be unleashed for the kind of mobile warfare at which Patton excelled. "This is what we've been waiting for," Patton told his staff as his Third Army was activated on August 1st. "In 10 days, we'll be at the Seine. In 30, at the German border." This section draws on General Omar Bradley's memoirs, A Soldier's Story, and the detailed accounts in the United States Army's The Breakout and Pursuit official history. Patton's Third Army poured through the gap created by Operation Cobra, with the newly arrived 4th Armored Division leading the charge. In what would become known as Patton's Run, American tanks raced across the Norman countryside, covering 70 miles in just 12 days. Towns that Allied planners had expected would take months to liberate fell in hours as German resistance crumbled in the face of the American onslaught. Meanwhile, the British and Canadians launched Operation Bluecoat to keep pressure on German forces in the eastern sector. Field Marshal Montgomery followed this with Operation Totalize, an ambitious attempt to encircle and destroy the German forces around Falaise. These operations kept the bulk of the German armor tied down, preventing it from being sent to counter Patton's advance. Hitler, still refusing to acknowledge the deteriorating situation, ordered a counterattack. Operation Lüttich, directed at the town of Mortain, was intended to drive a wedge between the American First and Third Armies, cutting off Patton's spearheads and reaching the coast to split the Allied beachhead. The attack began on August 7th, with elements of 4 Panzer divisions striking westward. The German offensive achieved initial surprise, but quickly stalled. Allied air superiority proved decisive. Operating from newly constructed forward airfields in Normandy, Allied fighter bombers caught German tank columns in the open, destroying dozens of vehicles. American artillery, directed by forward observers on Hill 317, a critical height gallantly held by the 30th Infantry Division despite being surrounded, pounded the advancing Germans. Within 48 hours, the German attack had been contained. More importantly, it had created a strategic opportunity for the Allies. With the bulk of Germany's remaining armor committed to the Mortain offensive, they had left their eastern flank exposed. The Allies could now potentially encircle the entire German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army. General Eisenhower recognized this opportunity and directed a change in strategy. Rather than continuing Patton's drive eastward toward Paris, he ordered part of the Third Army to turn north toward Argentan. From the north, the British and Canadians would push south toward Falaise. If the two Allied forces could meet, they would complete the encirclement of the German armies in Normandy. This developing pocket became known as the Falaise Gap. As Allied forces closed in from the north and south, tens of thousands of German soldiers found themselves in danger of being trapped. General Hans Eberbach, commanding the German forces, recognized the peril and began frantically organizing an evacuation eastward through the narrowing corridor. The roads were jammed with vehicles and men, all trying to escape, recalled Major Friedrich von Seidlitz of the 2nd Panzer Division. Allied aircraft appeared constantly overhead, strafing and bombing. We called it the Corridor of Death. By August 20th, The gap had been closed when Polish forces from the 1st Canadian Army met American forces at Chambois. Approximately 50,000 German troops were trapped inside the pocket. Another 30,000 had escaped, but had been forced to abandon most of their heavy equipment. The scene inside the Falaise pocket was apocalyptic. Allied artillery and aircraft pounded the shrinking German position relentlessly. Thousands of vehicles were destroyed, creating massive traffic jams of burning wreckage. The roads became impassable, not only because of destroyed equipment, but also because of the bodies of men and horses killed in the bombardment. "It was the grimmest battlefield I had ever seen," wrote Canadian war correspondent Ross Munro. "The ditches were filled with dead. Germans, dead horses, overturned vehicles. The stench of death was overpowering." The destruction of the German forces in the Falaise pocket effectively ended the Battle of Normandy. The German 7th Army had been virtually destroyed as a fighting force. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had replaced Rommel after the latter was wounded in an Allied air attack, committed suicide rather than face Hitler's wrath over the defeat. With the German defenses in Normandy shattered, Allied forces raced eastward. On August 25th, French and American troops liberated Paris, with General Charles de Gaulle leading a triumphant parade down the Champs-Élysées the following day. By early September, Allied forces had reached the German border, and Patton's prediction had proven remarkably accurate. The Battle of Normandy had cost the Allies dearly, over 200,000 casualties, including over 37,000 dead. But German losses were catastrophic, nearly 450,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Perhaps more importantly, the Germans had lost irreplaceable equipment and experienced officers. The Wehrmacht would never fully recover from the defeat in Normandy. As Allied forces pushed toward Germany, the strategic situation had been transformed. D-Day and the subsequent Battle of Normandy had opened the Western Front that Stalin had long demanded. Now the Third Reich faced enemies on all sides, and the countdown to its final defeat had begun. As autumn 1944 approached, the full strategic impact of D-Day and the Normandy campaign became increasingly clear. What had begun as a desperate gamble, the largest amphibious assault in military history, had evolved into a decisive turning point of the Second World War. The liberation of Western Europe was underway, and Nazi Germany found itself caught in a vice between advancing Allied forces from the west and the relentless Soviet advance from the east. Before D-Day, the Germans could shift forces between fronts to meet threats, noted British military historian B.H. Little Hart after the war. After Normandy, they were forced to fight on all fronts simultaneously, with diminishing resources and collapsing morale. This conclusion draws on Winston Churchill's 6-volume series The Second World War and Eisenhower's post-war assessment Crusade in Europe. The strategic consequences of the Normandy campaign were immense. With German forces in full retreat across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, Allied armies approached the German border by September. On September 11th, American troops crossed into Germany near Trier, the first Allied forces to enter the Reich itself. The myth of German invincibility, already damaged by defeats in North Africa and Russia, had been shattered completely. Hitler responded to these disasters by doubling down on his control of the German military, dismissing experienced commanders and replacing them with Nazi loyalists. He also ordered the implementation of the Volkssturm, a desperate mobilization of all remaining able-bodied men between 16 and 60 years old, poorly equipped and hastily trained to defend the fatherland. Meanwhile, resources were diverted to Hitler's wonder weapons, the V-1 and V-2 rockets, which, while technologically impressive, came too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. For the Allied powers, the success of D-Day and the Normandy campaign strengthened their unity of purpose, while simultaneously revealing tensions that would later shape the post-war world. General Eisenhower proved his diplomatic skills by managing the competing egos and national interests of the coalition. Yet disputes between Montgomery and the American generals, particularly Patton, foreshadowed later disagreements about war strategy and post-war Europe. The liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, provided a powerful symbolic moment. General Charles de Gaulle's triumphant procession down the Champs-Élysées reaffirmed French national pride and positioned France as a victorious power rather than merely a liberated nation. This distinction would prove crucial in determining France's post-war role in Europe and on the world stage. For ordinary soldiers who had fought through the campaign, the emotions were mixed. Veterans who had survived the bloodbath of Omaha Beach or the grinding battle of the hedgerows carried both pride in their achievements and traumatic memories that would haunt many for the rest of their lives. "We knew we'd been part of something historic," reflected Sergeant Frank Miller of the 1st Infantry Division in a 1994 interview. "But at the time, we weren't thinking about changing the course of the war. We were just trying to stay alive, to do our jobs, to look out for the men next to us." The Normandy campaign exacted an enormous human cost. Allied casualties totaled over 220,000 men, including more than 37,000 dead. German losses were even greater, approximately 450,000 killed, wounded, or captured. The civilian population of Normandy also suffered tremendously. More than 20,000 Norman civilians were killed during the fighting, and entire towns and villages were reduced to rubble. The physical scars of battle would take decades to heal. The once beautiful city of Caen had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. St. Lo was so thoroughly destroyed that it was dubbed the capital of ruins. Tens of thousands of unexploded bombs and mines littered the Norman countryside, causing casualties long after the fighting had moved eastward. Yet amid this destruction, D-Day also represented hope and the beginning of Europe's liberation from Nazi tyranny. As Allied forces pushed eastward, they uncovered the full extent of Nazi atrocities. The concentration camps, the mass graves, the evidence of systematic genocide, all confirmed the moral necessity of the war and validated the sacrifices made on the beaches and fields of Normandy. In the decades that followed, D-Day took on an almost mythic quality in the collective memory of the Allied nations. The courage and sacrifice of the men who stormed the beaches on June 6, 1944, became emblematic of what later generations would call the greatest generation. Memorial sites, museums, and cemeteries throughout Normandy now honor those who fought and died there. Perhaps the most eloquent testimony to the significance of D-Day came from President Ronald Reagan on the 40th anniversary of the landings. In 1984, speaking to assembled veterans at the Pointe du Hoc, where Army Rangers had scaled sheer cliffs under fire, "These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war." The invasion of Normandy demonstrated what could be achieved through international cooperation, technological innovation, and sheer human courage. The complex planning, the deception operations, the specialized equipment, all contributed to the success of what General Eisenhower had called the Great Crusade. But ultimately, it was the determination and sacrifice of individual soldiers, sailors, and airmen that secured victory. D-Day marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, although the war would continue for almost another year, with bitter fighting in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge and the difficult advance into Germany itself. The successful establishment of the Allied foothold in Normandy made the eventual outcome inevitable. The largest amphibious assault in history had indeed shifted the momentum of the Second World War irreversibly toward Allied victory. Today, the beaches where so much blood was spilled, Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, are peaceful stretches of sand, where children play and tourists enjoy the Norman sunshine. But the rows of white crosses and stars of David in the nearby cemeteries stand as eternal reminders of the price of freedom and the sacrifices made on that longest day in June 1944.